Tonight is different. No shocking twists, no dramatic reveals. Just 5 long, calm stories, told slowly, meant to be the last thing you hear before you fall asleep. Turn your volume down low. Get comfortable. Let your eyes close. Whenever they're ready. 5 real stories. 5 gentle endings. You don't need to stay awake for all of them. I'll be here talking softly for the next hour. Let's begin. My name is Eleanor and I am 62 years old, and I live now in a small coastal town in Maine, though for most of my adult life I lived considerably further inland, building a career and a family far from the specific stretch of rocky shoreline where I actually grew up. I want to tell you a slow story tonight, one without any sharp edges, about returning to my childhood home after 4 decades away, and about finishing something my mother had started and never had the chance to complete. My mother's name was Margaret, and she had been a lighthouse keeper's wife for the first 11 years of my life, living with my father in a modest keeper's cottage attached to a lighthouse that has, since we left, been automated and no longer requires anyone to live there full time, though the cottage itself still stands, weathered but intact, now owned by the local historical society who maintains it as a small seasonal museum. I want to describe what it was like to grow up in that cottage, the particular quality of light that came through salt-fogged windows in the mornings, the sound of the foghorn that became, over years, simply the background music of ordinary life rather than anything remarkable, and the specific persistent project my mother maintained throughout those 11 years, a garden she was slowly, patiently building along the cottage's south-facing wall, protected somewhat from the harsh coastal winds by the cottage's own structure. My mother's garden was never particularly grand. She worked with what the soil and climate actually allowed: hardy perennials, some herbs, a few rose bushes she babed through each difficult winter, and she had, for as long as I could remember, a specific vision she would describe to me while we worked together in the afternoons, a vision of eventually extending this garden along the entire southern wall, adding a small stone path, and creating what she called, with a particular hope she brought to this project, her someday garden, the version of this space she imagined completing once she had more time. Once I was older and needed less constant supervision, once various other demands on her attention had eased. I want to describe what actually happened instead, because my mother passed away unexpectedly when I was 11, a sudden illness that took her within a matter of weeks, faster than anyone had time to properly prepare for, leaving her someday garden exactly as it had been, half finished. The stone path she had been planning marked only by a few scattered stones she had gathered but never placed, existing from that point forward simply as an unfinished project rather than the completed vision she had described to me so many times during our afternoons working together in that soil. I want to describe what happened to that garden after we left the cottage, my father unable to continue living somewhere so saturated with grief, moving us inland within the year. A move that meant I did not see that cottage or its unfinished garden again for the following 4 decades, building my own entirely separate adult life far from that coastline, marrying, raising my own children, building a career, allowing that specific childhood chapter to become something I thought about occasionally but never actively returned to, until a letter arrived from the local historical society 18 months ago, informing me, as apparently the closest living relative they could locate, that the cottage was undergoing a renovation project and inquiring whether I might have any historical information, photographs or family stories that could help inform their restoration efforts, hoping to present the cottage as accurately as possible to visitors interested in its lighthouse keeper history. I want to describe what it felt like to receive this letter, understanding that this represented an invitation, unexpected and unplanned, back into a physical space I had spent 4 decades keeping at a comfortable emotional distance, and I want to describe the decision I eventually made, after several weeks of consideration, to actually travel back to that coastline myself, to see the cottage in person for the first time since childhood, understanding I could provide considerably more useful historical context in person than through any letter or phone call. I want to describe walking up that familiar path for the first time in 40 years, the cottage smaller than I remembered, as childhood spaces often are, but recognizable in every essential detail, the particular color the paint had weathered to, The specific angle of the roofline against the sky I remembered so clearly from countless childhood evenings. I want to describe walking around to the south-facing wall, half expecting to find nothing remaining of my mother's garden after 4 decades of neglect and whatever renovation work the Historical Society had already undertaken, finding instead, to my genuine surprise, that while the garden had certainly grown wild and overgrown in the intervening decades, its essential bones remained visible, the hardy perennials my mother had planted having apparently continued surviving and even spreading across these 4 decades with minimal human intervention, and most significantly, those scattered stones she had gathered for her never-completed path remaining exactly where she had left them, undisturbed by 4 decades of seasons and whatever various uses this space had seen since. I want to describe the decision I made in that moment, standing beside my mother's overgrown, unfinished garden, a decision that surprised even myself given how unplanned it was, asking the Historical Society representative who had accompanied me whether I might be permitted to spend some time actually working in this specific space during my visit, explaining, as I found the words to articulate what I was feeling, that I wanted to finish what my mother had started, to actually place those scattered stones into the path she had envisioned, to properly restore and complete this small specific vision she had described to me so many times but never had the chance to fully realize herself. Update. Several months later, I extended what was originally planned as a brief, several-day visit into nearly 3 weeks, working each morning in that garden, clearing decades of overgrowth with careful attention to preserving what my mother had originally planted, and on a quiet Tuesday afternoon during my second week, finally placing the last of those scattered stones into the specific path configuration I remembered my mother describing so many times during our afternoons working together. A path that now finally actually exists exactly as she had envisioned it, connecting her original garden bed to what had always been, in her descriptions, its natural extension along that protected southern wall. The Historical Society has incorporated this now completed garden into their restoration, and visitors to the cottage can now walk this specific path, my mother's someday garden finally realized, for decades later than she had planned, by the daughter she had been imagining would eventually help her finish it during those quiet afternoons that ended up being far more limited than either of us understood at the time. I have returned twice since that initial extended visit, maintaining this garden now as an ongoing gentle commitment, finding in this specific patient work a way of continuing a connection with my mother that feels different from simply remembering her. Something more active and ongoing, tending soil she once tended, completing a vision she once held, in the specific place where she held it most clearly. Eleanor finished a garden her mother started for decades earlier. Our next story tonight is also about something patient, about a man who spent 30 years writing letters to a brother he had never actually met. Let your breathing slow. Here is his story. My name is Robert and I am 58 years old, and I live in a quiet town in Oregon, and I want to tell you a slow, patient story tonight about a specific ritual I maintained for 30 years, writing occasional letters to a half-brother I had never actually met, letters I collected rather than sent, waiting for what I always imagined would eventually be the right moment to finally deliver them all together. I want to describe how I came to know this half-brother existed at all, learning, when I was 26 years old, through a conversation with my dying father, that he had a son from a relationship years before he met my mother, a son named Daniel who he had lost contact with decades earlier following circumstances my father described only vaguely during that final conversation, circumstances involving a difficult separation from Daniel's mother that had made ongoing contact genuinely difficult to maintain across the subsequent years and eventual decades. I want to describe what my father asked of me during that same conversation, expressing a specific, gentle hope that I might someday try to locate Daniel, to let him know he had a half-brother who existed and might welcome some form of connection, and request my father offered without any particular urgency or expectation, simply planting a possibility he hoped I might eventually pursue when circumstances felt right. I want to describe the specific decision I made in the years following my father's passing, beginning somewhat spontaneously, to write occasional letters addressed to Daniel, letters I never actually sent because I did not yet have any address or contact information for him, but that I found myself writing anyway, describing significant moments in my own life, sharing thoughts and reflections I might have shared with an actual brother had circumstances been different, gradually developing this into an occasional, ongoing practice that continued quietly across the following 3 decades, these letters accumulating in a specific box I kept for this exact purpose, each one written with a genuine, if patient, hope that someday I would locate Daniel and would have this entire collection ready to share with him all at once, representing 3 decades of a relationship I had been quietly building in my own mind despite never having actually met him. I want to describe the various efforts I made across these same decades to actually locate Daniel, periodic searches using whatever tools were available at different points, occasional consultations with people who specialized in exactly this kind of family search, each effort producing frustratingly limited results across many years, Daniel apparently having moved several times across different states, making him genuinely difficult to locate through the more limited search tools available. During earlier decades of this ongoing effort, I want to describe what finally changed 2 years ago. A specific genealogy website's improved search capabilities finally providing enough information to actually locate a current address for Daniel, information I received with a specific, careful hope after so many years of unsuccessful searching, prompting me to finally, after 3 decades of writing letters I had never sent, make the decision to actually reach out directly, sending an initial careful letter explaining who I was and the family connection we shared, along with a gentle inquiry about whether he might be interested in any form of contact, understanding this represented, after 30 years of patient private preparation, the actual beginning of a relationship I had been quietly imagining for the entirety of my adult life. Update. Several months later, Daniel responded to my initial letter within several weeks, expressing genuine warmth and interest in connecting, sharing that he had known vaguely about our father's other family but had never had any way to actually locate or reach out to us himself, having assumed across his own decades that this connection was simply not something that would ever become possible given how limited his own information about us had remained. We arranged an initial phone call and then, several months later, an actual in-person meeting, and I want to describe the specific moment I brought that box of 30 years of unsent letters with me to our first meeting, explaining what they represented, watching Daniel's expression as he understood he was receiving 3 decades of a relationship I had been quietly building even before I had any way to actually reach him. Daniel has read through this entire collection slowly, over the following months, and has told me that experiencing these letters, spanning 3 decades of my own life reflections written specifically with him in mind, has provided him with a considerably deeper, more immediate understanding of who I actually am than any equivalent number of months of ordinary, present-tense correspondence could have provided. We speak regularly now, and have visited each other several times, building, finally, the actual relationship those 30 years of patient letters had been quietly anticipating throughout their entire unsent existence. Robert's letters waited 30 years to be delivered. Our next story is about a different kind of waiting. A woman who spent years restoring a single piece of furniture, not for herself, for someone she had not yet met. If you're getting sleepy, that's all right. Here is her story. My name is Susan, and I am 44 years old, and I live in a small town in Vermont, and I want to tell you a slow, quiet story about a specific piece of furniture, a rocking chair that had belonged to my own grandmother, and the 6 years I spent slowly, patiently restoring it, working with the specific hope that I would someday have a grandchild of my own to use it, a hope I maintained across those 6 years despite not yet having any grandchildren, and for much of that period not even having children who were themselves old enough to be considering their own families. I want to describe how this rocking chair came into my possession, inherited following my grandmother's passing when I was in my late 20s, A piece of furniture that had genuinely been used and loved across multiple generations already by that point, my grandmother having herself inherited it from her own mother, meaning this chair had already rocked at least 3 generations of children to sleep before it ever came into my own care. That I want to describe the chair's actual condition when I received it, considerably worn after generations of genuine, loving use, the wood finish faded and scratched in places, the caning on the seat beginning to fray and would clearly need eventual replacement, and I want to describe the specific decision I made, relatively soon after receiving this chair, to begin a slow, careful restoration project, not rushed or urgent, but rather approached as an ongoing, patient hobby I would work on gradually across whatever time I could dedicate to it, motivated by a specific, if somewhat premature, hope that I wanted this chair to be genuinely ready, in excellent condition. I want to describe the actual restoration process itself, learning traditional caning techniques specifically to properly restore the seat rather than using any more modern, less authentic replacement material, carefully stripping and refinishing the wood using methods appropriate to the chair's genuine age and construction, working on this project during quiet evenings and weekends across what became, ultimately, 6 full years of patient, ongoing effort, treating this not as any urgent task, but rather as a meaningful meditative practice I genuinely enjoyed for its own sake, alongside the specific hope motivating it. I want to describe what this specific patient work meant to me throughout those 6 years, understanding as I worked, that I was essentially preparing something not for my own immediate use but for a future person who did not yet exist, a specific act of hope extended across years I could not actually predict the timeline of, not knowing when or even whether with certainty, I would eventually have grandchildren who might someday use this now carefully restored chair. Update. Several months later. My daughter gave birth to her first child, my first grandchild, a daughter of her own 7 months ago, and I want to describe the specific moment I finally brought this fully restored rocking chair to meet this new baby, setting it up in my daughter's nursery, explaining, as I positioned it carefully in the room's corner, the specific 6 years of patient restoration this chair represented, work I had begun long before this particular baby, or even her own mother's pregnancy, had been anything more than a hopeful, distant possibility. My daughter has told me that she uses this chair regularly now, during late-night feedings and quiet naptime moments, understanding as she rocks her own daughter in this same chair that rocked me as a child, and that rocked my mother before that, and her mother before that, that she is now part of an unbroken chain of family comfort spanning 4 generations, a chain I worked specifically to ensure remained strong and ready for exactly this moment, even during the many years when I could not have told you with any certainty when, or for whom, this specific preparation would eventually be needed. Susan's chair waited 6 years for a baby who did not yet exist. Our next story is about a different kind of patience, a man who learned an entire language to read letters his own grandfather had never translated. Rest your eyes if you need to. Here is his story. My name is Michael and I am 36 years old and I live in Chicago, Illinois, and I want to tell you a slow story about a box of letters my grandfather kept for over 50 years, written entirely in Polish, a language none of the rest of our family could read, and about the 4 years I spent learning this language specifically so I could finally understand what these letters actually contained. My grandfather's name was Joseph, and he had immigrated from Poland as a young man, decades before I was born, and I want to describe the specific box of letters he kept throughout his entire subsequent life in America, correspondence with family members who had remained in Poland, letters that continued arriving for many years before gradually stopping as, I eventually understood, the family members writing them passed away across the subsequent decades, leaving my grandfather with this accumulated collection of correspondence spanning several decades that he never had translated, keeping this box carefully preserved throughout his life without ever explaining its full contents to any of us, his English-speaking American family who had grown up without any ability to read Polish ourselves. I want to describe what happened to this box following my grandfather's own passing when I was 28 years old, inherited by My father, who similarly could not read Polish, stored carefully but essentially inaccessible to our family's actual understanding, until a specific afternoon, several months after the funeral, when I found myself looking through this box during a visit to my parents' home, genuinely curious about what these letters might contain, understanding that they represented a connection to family history that remained, for our English-speaking branch of the family, essentially locked away behind a language barrier none of us had ever addressed. I want to describe the specific decision I made in that moment, deciding somewhat impulsively but with a growing sense of genuine importance, that I wanted to actually learn Polish specifically to read these letters myself, rather than simply having them professionally translated by someone else, feeling as I considered this decision, that there was something meaningful about actually developing my own understanding of this language my grandfather had spoken throughout his entire life, rather than receiving these deeply personal family letters filtered through a stranger's translation. I want to describe the actual process of learning Polish across the following 4 years, beginning with basic language courses, gradually progressing to more advanced study specifically focused on the kind of vocabulary and grammar patterns I would need to actually read historical, handwritten correspondence rather than simply conversational modern Polish, a considerably more challenging undertaking than I had initially anticipated, requiring genuine, sustained dedication across these 4 years alongside my ordinary work and family responsibilities. Update. Several months later, I finally reached a level of proficiency that allowed me to begin actually reading through my grandfather's letters approximately 8 months ago, and I want to describe what I discovered within them. Correspondence spanning several decades from various family members, aunts and uncles and cousins I had never known existed, describing their own daily lives in Poland across years that included, I learned with particular emotional weight, some of the most difficult periods of 20th century European history, these letters providing an intimate, personal window into family experiences during historical events I had only previously understood through distant, impersonal textbook descriptions. I have shared these translations with my extended family, providing all of us, for the first time, genuine access to this significant piece of our family history that had remained locked away for over 50 years, and I have found in this specific patient 4-year process of learning an entire language specifically to access these letters, a form of connection to my grandfather and our broader family history that feels considerably deeper than any equivalent understanding I might have gained through simply hiring a translator, having genuinely absorbed, through years of dedicated study, something of the actual language my grandfather thought and felt in throughout his own life. Michael learned an entire language for his grandfather's letters. Our final story tonight is about the longest wait of the evening. A woman who waited 25 years to finish a quilt. This is the last story. You can let yourself drift off whenever you're ready. Here is her story. My name is Dorothy, and I am 67 years old, and I live in a small town in North Carolina, and I want to tell you the final, slowest story of tonight, about a quilt I began making 25 years ago. A quilt that took this entire quarter century to complete, not because I was working on it constantly throughout this period, but because I made the specific decision at the very beginning of this project that each individual square would represent a specific meaningful moment in my life, added only when that particular moment actually occurred, meaning this quilt's completion timeline was determined not by my own pace of work, but by the actual unfolding pace of my own life's significant experiences. I want to describe how this project began 25 years ago, following a period of genuine difficulty in my own life, a divorce that had left me searching for some kind of meaningful, ongoing creative practice that could help me process this transition while also, I hoped, eventually creating something beautiful from what had begun as a genuinely difficult period. I want to describe the specific rule I established for myself at this project's outset, deciding that I would add one new square to this quilt only when something genuinely significant occurred in my life, whether difficult or joyful, creating each square specifically to represent and process that particular experience, rather than simply working steadily towards some predetermined completion date. I want to describe some of the specific squares this approach eventually produced across the following 25 years. An early square commemorating my own successful establishment of independent financial stability following my divorce. A square marking my daughter's wedding several years later. A particularly difficult square I created during a period of serious illness, working through genuine fear and uncertainty stitch by careful stitch during my recovery. A joyful square celebrating my first grandchild's birth, and numerous other squares spanning this quarter century, each one connected to a specific, genuinely significant moment I had lived through, meaning this quilt had become, by its very nature, an actual physical timeline of my own most meaningful life experiences across these 25 years that I want to describe what it felt like to work on this project across such an extended, unpredictable timeline. Some years producing multiple new squares as significant events clustered together, other periods passing for a year or more without any new addition simply because life, during those particular stretches, had not produced anything I felt rose to the specific level of significance this project required, meaning this quilt's actual pace of completion remained, throughout its entire 25-year creation, genuinely unpredictable and entirely tied to my own life's actual unfolding rather than any artificial schedule I might have imposed. Update. Several months later, I added what I understood as I created it would likely be this quilt's final square 6 months ago. A square commemorating my own 67th birthday and the specific quiet contentment I have found in this particular chapter of my life, understanding, as I completed this specific square, that the quilt itself now felt genuinely complete, representing 25 years of my own most significant life experiences captured in fabric and thread. Each square telling its own specific story, within the larger, unpredictable timeline of this entire remarkable project. I have since had this completed quilt professionally framed and displayed prominently in my own home, and I find myself on quiet evenings, sometimes simply looking at this quilt, each square calling back a specific memory, a specific period of my own life, understanding that I have created something genuinely unique, a quilt whose actual creation timeline became, through my own deliberate choice 25 years ago, as meaningful and significant as the finished object itself. That was all 5 stories tonight. If you're still awake, thank you for staying with me. If you fell asleep somewhere along the way, I hope it was peaceful. If you'd like more calm stories like this to fall asleep to, subscribe and I'll have another one ready soon. Sleep well. Good night.